Coming up on Dialogue Weekend, the virtual 13th Asia-Europe meeting was held on Thursday and Friday this week. What did it address, and how will it help boost Asia-Europe cooperation? For the first time, the United States has been added to a list of backsliding democracies in a European think tank report. What's ailing American democracy today? And this week's newsmaker. Now, on Dialogue Weekend.
Welcome to this edition of Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xu Qinduo. Leaders from Asian and European countries are meeting to discuss multilateralism with an eye on economic recovery after the COVID-19 pandemic. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang delivered a speech at the 13th Summit of Asia-Europe Meeting, or ASEM. So what's been happening during the meeting, and how will this focus on multilateralism help promote global development and prosperity? To find out, I'm joined by Professor John Gong at the University of International Business and Economics, and Michele Garacci, former Under-Secretary of State of the Ministry of Economic Development of Italy. So welcome to the show, gentlemen. We'll start with Michele. So what's your takeaway of this meeting, which lasted basically, probably for one more day to go?
It's always a positive event when trading blocs like Europe and Asia meet to discuss how to improve terms of trade, especially true in this time of a pandemic. There are some issues that need to be discussed and solved, because we have always the situation where when we have two blocks that are at different stages of development, Europe relatively well developed, Asia with few exceptions still a developing continent, the needs of those two blocks may be different. We do know that, for example, in the case of China, since entering to the WTO 20 years ago, China has benefited a lot. Other emerging markets have also benefited from trade, because we do know that trade narrows disparity in between countries. The thing that we need to fix is that, however, it creates disparities within the country. And we have seen this in some Asian countries, we've seen this in European countries, we've seen this in the United States. So what this meeting needs to address is not just how to improve the terms and lower the disparity between regions of the world, but also how each national government should address the disparity within their own countries. And this is the biggest problem.
Well, John, looking at the meeting from Asian angle, what's your take?
Let me say that this is mostly a forum for exchange opinions, exchange ideas. In terms of solving problems, solving issues, I don't think it's kind of a platform to really enforce things. And I think your previous speaker is absolutely right that there are existing problems both in Europe and Asia that needs to be addressed, especially issues relating to sustainable development and as well as equality issues, things like that. But I think at this point, in terms of really solving problems, I'm a little bit skeptical, especially this is not a forum for addressing issues in each respective block of countries. And particularly also true for the reason that this is it has seen expanding membership. I mean, it's not just the original European Union and ASEM countries, and plus China, South Korea, and Japan. You're not starting to see other countries like Russia and Kazakhstan and other countries joining this discussion as well. And when you have such a diverse set of countries with diverse set of interests, it's probably going to be very difficult to solve real problems. Some people say that the ASEM is mostly a talking shop. I actually tend to agree that it's a forum for exchanging ideas, expressing opinions, but it's not going to be going very far in terms of solving real problems.
Probably this mechanism is not designed to solve really specific problems. But anyway, in particular at the time of the pandemic, having leaders from different parts of the world to talking to each other, through the video link is a good thing. The one thing they discussed actually is the theme of the meeting is the multilateralism for shared growth. They use the word strengthening multilateralism. So John, when they focus on the multilateralism, usually it means there's something wrong with multilateralism. For example, the weakening of multilateralism over the past years in particular, and Donald Trump, the unilateral approach, for example, has damaged this practice of multilateralism. What we can do right now, like for European countries, for Asian countries, to strengthen multilateralism?
Yeah, I think they have a very interesting idea. The idea called Minilateralism. I think the idea came about amidst the dysfunction and the failure of the absolute multilateralism that has been prevalent in several international organizations. For example, at WTO, we need to build consensus. What does it mean by building consensus? That means that every member state has to agree. And this is becoming increasingly difficult. I think there are countries that are very frustrated with this process, that things are very difficult to get done, that things are getting very slow to get done. And I think this very concept, idea of minilateralism, meaning that to find common denominators among just a few set of countries and try to solve problems, try to do things, is actually a quite interesting idea. And I think if this is workable within the larger context of international order, the international order, UN-based international order, and this is something that can be indeed explored and workable in my view on some issues that probably don't become of conflict with a lot of countries. And I think it's indeed, let's have a starting point with a select number of countries, and build some consensus only among this small subset of countries, but really implement things, really do things, move things forward. And I think that's an interesting approach that needs to be explored. And I think this forum could be a starting point.
Michaela, obviously, John mentioned this like a popular phrase here, minilateralism, to strengthen multilateralism. If you take a look at the current practice, you see there's for example, in Asian, Pacific region, there's RCEP to go into effect early next year. You have TPCPP, DCP, I believe, and also like China, European Union. There's an investment deal to be approved by both sides. It's more like a regional or bilateral liberalization, free trade. But multilaterally or globally, like WTO, is still being paralyzed. What's your idea? What we need to do, in particular for Asia and European countries, to again, prop up the multilateralism?
Well, there's two ways to develop multilateralism. One is top-down, so 200 countries join and discuss and agree on what to do. And the other one is bottom-up. So we start with bilateral, then this bilateral becomes a regional agreement, then someone does it in Europe, someone does it in Asia, in America, Canada, Mexico, they had the NAFTA. And then these components, like a puzzle, you build the small pieces, they get bigger and bigger, they even overlap, like you said, the CCPT and RCEP have an overlap. And then this is the driver that leads to multilateralism, on which then the WTO does the job to manage all these. So I do think that these regional or even bilateral agreements are not against the multilateralism, are actually positive building blocks. And of course, we need to recognize that if we want to reach a true global trade system that works, we need the leadership of the 3-4 main economic blocs in the world. So you mentioned, for example, the EU-China agreement. That is also good. We even can discuss about the US-China Phase 1 agreement that was signed a while back between Vice Premier Liu He and Lai Taisa in the previous administration. Some people were a little bit skeptical or even worried that this would lead to only bilateral, leaving out the rest of the world. But if done well, they actually can lead. You know, I do the example in Glasgow, COP26, countries could not agree. And then on Friday night, we had the agreement between China and the US, the two leaders in this agenda, let's say the biggest country that emits CO2. So that they are the problem. And also they came up with some sort of a common statement to say, we can now together provide the solution. And then everyone else would follow. And I think that's why I believe that this bilateral or even regional agreement do serve the purpose of building blocks for larger ones. So I'm very positive, provided that then everything feeds into the WTO. There needs to be the overall, let's say, referee of the trade issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, Miguel, well said over there. You know, one session was devoted to the discussion for connectivity. You know, this word itself reminds me of BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, if there's one feature to describe this initiative, is really about the connection or connectivity, physically or, I mean, in tangibly, for example, the soft connection, people to people, for example, in particular between Asian countries and I would say European continent. You know, the connectivity over there, the rail service, for example, from China to some of the European ports during this pandemic have worked very well. I mean, I wonder what comment do you have for that? You know, for that connectivity.
Well, as you know, I'm a big fan of the Belt and Road initiatives. And it's not because it's done by China. It's because I think it's a good idea. It's because I think that Asia and Africa and Europe and even America do need the development on infrastructure. I've seen how China has managed to grow the economy and be successful also via building transport. You know, 10 years ago, in 2008, there was only the Beijing-Tianjin high-speed railway. Now we almost have 40,000 kilometers of high speed, and this has changed the life of people. So it's a transformational investment. It's not a evolutionary one. In the case of China, it's been revolutionary by changing the way people live, work, travel, and this, of course, has created more connectivity, the one you're referring to, soft between people. I make some trivial example. People from Shanghai have been closer in contact with people coming from rural areas that migrated thanks to this transport, and they work together. And this has lowered maybe some prejudice that we have also within countries, even bigger when we're talking about inter-country, so between one country and the other one. So welcome to the Belt and Road. Even the Build Back Better World, the G7 US-led initiative, that's also excellent. You know, the world has room for all initiatives. And if there is a healthy competition between the BRI, which, by the way, is not China, is 100 plus countries, and the Build Back Better World, which is some European Western countries, some of which are also part of the Belt and Road, it's excellent. Asia and Africa, 6 billion people, do need this kind of joint relationship and development. And this also helps smooth the geopolitical tensions that we may have. Because, you know, when it is companies and individuals that find jobs, that find the business opportunities, so the governments listen.
It's all good about the connectivity. Nothing bad about that. Let's move on. The US has been listed as backsliding in democracy for the first time by a European think tank. In the meanwhile, a UN human rights expert said that the electoral laws in some parts of the US, including Texas, may undermine democracy by depriving millions of citizens who belong to minority groups of the equal right to vote. Why is the American democracy in distress? What does it take to overcome the challenges? Can they do it? For this part, again, we have John and Michaela. John, you know, are you surprised to see the U.S. being listed as a part of the country with backsliding democracy?
There's no deniable. It's not deniable that absolutely that is what's exactly happening in the United States. I mean, I would just point out a couple of things. First of all, I mean, the June 6th riot is very clear as an insurrection, right? But the U.S. Congress cannot introduce a statement on this thing, uniformly, unify both L's of the Congress to issue a statement about this. There are those people, mostly on the GOP side, just being resisting a fair investigation of this issue. You look at the voter suppression legislations across the country in southern states, in the state of Georgia and the state of Texas and some other states. And there, what are these legislations for? Nothing more than suppressing the minority population voters from going out and cast a vote, cast a ballot. And this is just deplorable. I think this is now going on across the landscape, across the country in the United States. And I think a backsliding is an understatement. I mean, there are people who are saying that there could be those very, very dangerous moments where the American sort of liberal democracy is going to be totally ruined by this ex-president, but as well as other very strong supporters in the Congress, these GOP senators and congressmen. So I think if you talk to any political scientists in the university community, there's no denying that the U.S. democracy is going through a backsliding right now.
Yeah, Michaela, okay, probably no dispute about the U.S., something wrong with the democracy over there. Mostly people focus on Donald Trump, for example, his rejection of the 2020 election result. But some other would say this is a much bigger issue than Trump himself. Do you agree?
I do, because democracy, let's not forget, it comes from the Greek demos kratos, which means power to the people. We have maybe forgotten this origin, and we have now in the West associated democracy with voting. And sometimes voting is not the only way to give people power, to give power to the people. It is, and it may work in some countries, but it may work less in other countries. But I think we in the West have been stuck with confusing the end with the mean and the mean with an end. We have forgotten what democracy means, and we have just been, in a way, happy, content, satisfied to let people vote. And of course, every voting system has its problem. The US, they vote by states, so the popular vote is not the same as the vote of the grand electors. We have in England a first past the post system where you can be the number two parties with even a 60-70% popular vote, and you get 0 seats in the British Parliament, in the House of Commons. These are extreme situations, of course, but then that's why we are stuck with making this voting mechanism closer to giving back power to the people. And then we have another issue, which is the layering. And we are debating, even in my country, the value and the advantages of having a direct democracy or indirect. We have people voting for the Italian parliament, then the Italian parliament selects the government, then the government selects a representative in Brussels, and then the European Commission decides. So we have like 4 layers. And, this is a big challenge that we need to address because we cannot have 60 million, in the case of Italy, representative. But the more layer we have, the least people have power.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, the good point, by Michaela, people have the power and also democracy as a means or as an end itself. If you look at democracy, usually people think about the electoral democracy in the Western style, for example. But China stressed very much about, this all process people's democracy with some election, with some promotion. And it stressed very much about the ends. It means that whether you can deliver.
Yeah, I think this is hits the nail right on the head. You know, the discussion about whether democracy is a means to an end or just the end. And what is democracy good for if at the end of the day it doesn't solve any problem? It doesn't solve the inflation problem, for example, the supply chain shock problem, if it doesn't solve the poverty problem. All these things are note for average folks if their very life is not being solved by this process, by the system. So I think the idea that President Xi raised is actually a very good idea, I think interesting idea, to view democracy from the from the perspective of whole process, what he described as a whole process democracy. I think what the Communist Party here in China, their main mantra is that it's people-centered agenda. That's what President Xi has been insisting on and being adamant about. Just try to solve people's problem. Here we solve the poverty alleviation problem, for example. We're now getting into issues of solving the housing problem, medical insurance, medical access problem, education issues, and all these things that really people care about. So I think here's a very sharp contrast here. In the United States, it's more about the voting, about congressional politics. I just give you one example. America needs desperately some infrastructure improvement. We've been talking about this ever since 2016 when President Trump came to power. He was proposing this idea about making America great again. Instead, he made America, backsliding to backsliding in terms of democracy. But our infrastructure, he did nothing. It took Joe Biden, thank goodness, he passed this bill. It took Joe Biden, President Biden, 11 months to get this bill passed, right? And finally, starting to have this $1.7 trillion of infrastructure improvement. It takes if you put this thing together, 5 years to get the infrastructure bill. And it took us 2 years just to build the railway the high-speed railway from Beijing to Shanghai. 1,300 kilometers long railway. 2 years, less than 2 years. It took the United States 5 years just to get this bill passed. So I think that's the difference here. So again, I would say democracy definitely is something that needs to solve problems. Otherwise, I think it's really something just not good for some. I would say good for
more problems. Yes. Well, let's leave it there for now and take a look at this week's newsmaker. Well, the U.S. has announced it will release millions of barrels of oil from strategic reserves in coordination with India, South Korea, Japan, and Britain to try to cool prices after OPEC Plus producers ignored calls for more crude. So how will this affect the energy market? For this part, we are joined by international investor Jim Rogers. Welcome to the show, Jim. So in the past, strategic reserve release usually is a response to, for example, in the 1991, the warring time, the Gulf War, or the early 2000, Hurricane Katrina. For this time around, the given reason is the inflation. Some others say it's also political consideration. What do you make?
Well, it's exactly right. The other two were a bit more serious or different. This is somewhat brought on by our own actions. Mr. Biden has cut pipelines. He has tried to cut drilling for oil. America is the largest producer of oil in the world, and yet Mr. Biden is not trying to get America to increase production. He's trying to get other countries. One of the things that happens to democracies is they fall apart when they start pandering to lots of special interest groups. That's what's part of what's happening in America now.
Well, most importantly, whether this move, with the release of a strategic reserve, help basically lower the prices at the, the stations, for example, for Americans, at least temporary. Is that will it work?
50 million barrels is less than 3 days of consumption in the U.S. Maybe it will lower prices for an hour or two, but that is not going to have any major effect.
Well, John, if you look at the OPEC plus, the oil producers, they have been asked to increase the amount of production, but they rejected this request. Why did they request? Why did they refuse to cooperate with the U.S., for example, here?
Huge amount of cash.
Well, first let me say the OPEC organization is the world's probably only legal collusion. I mean, it's a cartel. I mean, end of the day, this is a cartel, and cartel, it's anti-competition, right? I mean, we all know that, and the reason OPEC is still able to organize, is still able to function, is because it's a cartel formed by sovereign countries. I mean, there are several lawsuits brought up in the United States courts against OPEC, but they've been thrown out of court because this is something that's organized by sovereign states. So let's first be clear. The very existence of OPEC is based on a anti-competition tenet, and they've been able to do this by not. I mean, this is basically a price fixing. I mean, they don't fix prices, but they try. I mean, essentially, this is price fixing via limitation on production. It's a quota thing. So first of all, this is uncompetitive in my view. Okay, and I think to address Jim's question about increasing U.S. production, I think Biden is right by not increasing new explorations. I think it's okay to increase production with the existing facilities, but I think in the context of the climate change, every country needs to pitch in. Let's not make more explorations. Let's not dig up more oil wells. But in terms of increasing production, absolutely. We should increase production when the economy recovers, when the price goes up like this. And there's nothing wrong with it in my view. And second, I think the OPEC members, they have to really think about this very important question. They have been able to limit production through their quota system because there's suppressed demand during the pandemic time. Now the pandemic is about to be over, economy is coming back, demand is increasing, and they are still doing this. And that just raises eyebrows for a lot of people. And certainly, I'm very critical of their decision that they're doing this at this time, and this shouldn't be happening. I mean, they should be thinking about in the context of helping with the global economy. You see inflation going on everywhere, oil prices are going up, and they're now refusing to increase production. This is just not right.
Well, Jim, obviously they are going to have a meeting. I mean, the OPEC plus countries, they are going to have a meeting, but likely result is they are not going to increase the production over there. And given that, if this release of a strategic reserve, oil reserve, fail to dampen the price, so what will happen? Are we going to see the price remain high for quite some time?
We are going to see higher prices and higher inflation. Governments have been printing huge amounts of money all over the world. And throughout history, when you print a lot of money, it leads to inflation. I mean, these are simple facts.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you, John. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Again, many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thank you for watching. See you next time.